The room was cold, but not because of the air conditioning. It was the silence, tense, electric, and loaded with the weight of war. Cameras had been allowed in for only 5 minutes before the doors shut. Behind those heavy doors sat two men whose faces had become the embodiment of opposite worlds, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The UN had organized this emergency peace dialogue after weeks of bloodshed in Gaza. Images of collapsed buildings, dust-covered children, and grieving families had flooded global media. Protests had erupted from New York to Johannesburg. The world wanted silence, Netanyahu wanted order, but Traoré wanted justice. Traoré entered the room with no entourage, no army, just a worn leather folder in his hand. He took his seat across from Netanyahu, who sat stiff, guarded, surrounded by aides. The Israeli leader gave a tight nod. Traoré simply returned it with a cold stare. The moderator, a UN diplomat from Norway, began. "Gentlemen, the world is watching. The goal today is simple. Can we build a framework for peace?" Netanyahu spoke first. His voice calm, rehearsed, polished. "We are here because Israel seeks peace. We've offered ceasefires. We've warned Hamas. We've protected our borders. But we won't tolerate terrorism." Then Traoré leaned forward. His voice was low but sharp enough to cut steel. "Peace," he said. "You bomb schools and call it defense. You bury children and call it policy. And you sit here and say you want peace?" There was a beat of silence. Netanyahu frowned, his aides shifting nervously. The moderator raised a hand, but Traoré didn't stop. "You want peace when the cameras are on. But off camera, your drones don't sleep." Netanyahu leaned back, arms crossed. "This isn't constructive," he muttered. Traoré opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a burned-out hospital wing in Gaza. "This is why I came. Not for photo ops. Not for diplomacy. For truth." The room was no longer cold, it was boiling. And Traoré hadn't even raised his voice yet. The silence was no longer polite, it had turned aggressive. Netanyahu's jaw tightened as he looked down at the photograph. For a moment, the room felt like a courtroom, and Traoré had just delivered the first piece of evidence. A UN aide stepped forward to collect the photo, but Traoré's hand shot out to stop him. "Let him look at it," he said firmly, eyes locked on Netanyahu. "Let him look long enough to see the blood on the bricks." Netanyahu didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the moderator. "I'm not here to be accused. I'm here to negotiate. And negotiation begins with truth," Traoré countered. "You say you want peace, but peace without justice is just a treaty between weapons." A murmur passed through the observers seated behind the glass. These weren't mere insults, they were indictments. And from Traoré, they landed with weight. The moderator cleared his throat. "Captain Traoré, if we could return to the framework." But Traoré raised a hand, silencing the room. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward again. "You lied to your own people. You told them Gaza was a threat that had to be neutralized. You told the world it was self-defense. But the images, the screams, the mass graves, they all say something different." Netanyahu's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar?" he asked, voice low. Traoré didn't blink. "I'm saying the truth fears you. Because when it speaks, you bury it under rubble." The moderator froze. Netanyahu's aides whispered furiously among themselves. One of them reached for their phone. But Traoré wasn't done. "I'm not here to play diplomat. I represent the children who never made it to age 5, the mothers who gave birth under collapsing ceilings. You may not see them, but I do, every time I close my eyes." The moderator, visibly rattled, stood and called for a recess. 10 minutes, he said. But as Netanyahu stood to leave, Traoré remained seated, eyes never leaving him. And that stare, silent, unflinching, spoke louder than any accusation. The hallway outside the negotiation room was lined with diplomats, security personnel, and whispering journalists behind red velvet ropes. Netanyahu stepped out first, flanked by his advisors, his expression unreadable but tight. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions he had no intention of answering. 10 steps behind, Ibrahim Traoré emerged, alone again. No aides, no notes, no scripted lines. Just the unshakable weight of what he represented. And as he walked, a hush fell over the corridor. Not because of fear, but because of gravity. A Western journalist finally spoke up. "Captain Traoré, are the talks collapsing?" He paused, turned, and answered without hesitation. "The truth collapsed first. Now we're just standing in its ruins." Inside the break room, Netanyahu sipped from a white porcelain cup, silent, brooding. One of his aides leaned in. "He's playing to the cameras." Netanyahu shot him a glare. "He's playing to something more dangerous, conscience." Elsewhere, Traoré stood at a window overlooking the East River, his hands behind his back, his shoulders straight. A UN staffer timidly approached. "Captain, if I may, your words, they're being broadcast. People are listening." He turned slowly, eyes heavy with purpose. "Then let them hear everything." Back in the main room, the second session was about to begin. But the tension had multiplied. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't about policy drafts or strategic clauses anymore. It was about who would define the narrative. Netanyahu returned to the table with more advisors, more papers. Traoré returned with the same leather folder, and silence. The moderator took his seat. "Gentlemen, let us continue. There is still hope for a middle ground." But before anyone could speak, Traoré opened his folder again. This time, it wasn't a photo, it was a letter. Written by a child from Rafah, he said quietly. It was found in her backpack under the rubble. He began to read it aloud, word by word, as the room fell into a frozen, haunted stillness. And as the final line echoed, "Please, stop the sky from falling," even the walls seemed to mourn. The room had never been quieter. No shuffling papers. No murmurs from aides. No digital beeps from phones. Just the echo of a child's final plea lingering in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Netanyahu's hand slowly moved toward his water glass but stopped halfway. His face was stoic, but his eyes betrayed something: annoyance, discomfort, maybe even shame. The moderators didn't dare speak. Traoré folded the letter with delicate care, as if it were sacred, and slid it back into his folder. "You talk of peace," he said softly, "but your tanks never stop moving. You talk of ceasefires, but you forget the fires never cease." Netanyahu finally found his voice. "Captain Traoré, with all due respect, you are not a party to this conflict. You speak from passion, not position." Traoré didn't flinch. "You're wrong. I speak from the position of humanity." He stood slowly, not to storm out, but to face the room, every delegate, every diplomat, every strategist whose silence made them complicit. "Do you know why I'm here?" he asked. "Because silence kills slower than bombs, but it kills just the same." The Israeli PM leaned forward. "Then tell me, Captain, what would you have us do? Let terrorists run free? Let rockets rain down?" Traoré's eyes sharpened. "If your response to terror is to become terror itself, then you've already lost." The moderator interjected, trying to salvage diplomacy. "Perhaps we should steer toward actionable steps." But Netanyahu was no longer listening. He tapped his pen against the table, clearly rattled. He was used to being confronted by foreign ministers, critics, even protesters. But not like this. Not by a man who refused the game altogether. Traoré's final words before sitting down again landed like thunder. "Peace without accountability is theater. And Gaza is tired of being your stage." A chill moved through the room. Cameras rolled in silence, capturing every breath, every twitch, every blink. And for the first time in the summit, Benjamin Netanyahu had no words. News didn't wait for press releases. It escaped through cracks, leaked from whispers, and exploded through headlines before the summit had even adjourned for the day. African leader confronts Netanyahu at UN. Traoré reads Gaza child's letter aloud, silence in the chamber. Truth bomb drops in peace talks. By the time Traoré returned to his hotel, the world had already reacted. Protesters had printed the words, "Peace without accountability is theater," on banners in London, Cape Town, and Washington, D.C. Social media exploded. Not with hashtags, but with outrage, with heartbreak, with hope. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's media team scrambled. Their narrative of defending national security was now undercut by a single man who spoke of children and rubble, not geopolitics and borders. They prepared a press statement, but inside the delegation, tension brewed. Netanyahu paced his suite, visibly agitated. "He's weaponizing emotion," one aide said. "No," Netanyahu snapped. "He's weaponizing truth. And it's working." That same night, Traoré addressed a room of African and Middle Eastern delegates in a private gathering. The atmosphere was different, warmer, charged with solidarity. "I did not come here to humiliate," he began. "I came here to remind that Africa remembers what occupation feels like. That we, too, were told peace could wait." He spoke of colonization, resistance, and the moral courage of standing alone if the world is afraid to stand with you. "What we're witnessing in Gaza," he said, "isn't foreign to us. It's history trying to repeat itself. And I refuse to let that happen silently." A standing ovation followed, not because of grandeur, but because of clarity. Somewhere across town, Netanyahu's team was writing a counter-speech. Strong. Strategic. Defensive. But what they couldn't write was what Traoré had already delivered. A story no talking point could erase. The next morning, the United Nations was swarmed, not just with diplomats, but with cameras, activists, and citizens holding signs. Outside the gates, a new wave of protesters had arrived. Some held Palestinian flags. Others waved banners reading, "We stand with Traoré," and "Truth has no border." Inside, the second day of peace talks was meant to be procedural. Formalities. Drafts of non-binding agreements. But nothing felt routine anymore. Traoré entered first, alone again, nodding silently to a few African delegates. Netanyahu followed, expression stiff, flanked by an unusually large entourage. The air buzzed with anticipation, something was coming. The moderator opened the session, voice clipped, eyes weary. "Before we begin, does either party wish to address the floor?" Netanyahu spoke first, his tone colder than yesterday. "I came here for peace. But peace cannot exist in a vacuum of truth. And it cannot be built on emotional theater designed to weaken legitimate defense." It was a sharp shot, but Traoré didn't move. He didn't need to. "Defense without boundaries becomes destruction," Traoré replied, voice level. "And destruction repeated becomes policy. That's not security. That's conquest." Netanyahu pushed forward. "What do you expect me to do? Sit while our people are attacked?" "No," Traoré said slowly. "I expect you to sit and listen to the voices buried under your walls. If peace means silencing the dead, then it's not peace. It's erasure." The room tensed. Traoré stood once more, this time holding a folder filled with documents, eyewitness accounts, timelines, satellite images. He laid them one by one on the table. "I didn't just come with emotion," he said. "I came with evidence." A low gasp rippled through the delegates. "I dare this body to read them. I dare you all to look beyond your alliances. Because history will." He turned to Netanyahu. "And when history asks who told the truth, I want to be able to say, I did. Even when it hurt. Even when it cost me everything." This time, the silence wasn't stiff. It was shaken. That afternoon, the sealed folder Traoré had placed on the table began to circulate, not officially, but virally. A few delegates photographed its contents. Then international journalists leaked fragments, photos of collapsed schools, time-stamped drone footage, declassified aid reports withheld from public record. The truth was no longer whispered, it was roaring. News anchors struggled to keep up. Traoré's evidence dismantles official narratives. UN session erupts over Gaza dossier. Leaders divided, public united. Across the globe, screens were lit not with war footage, but with Traoré's voice. Clips of his speech subtitled in French, Arabic, Spanish, and even Hebrew trended across platforms. Not as sound bites, but as warnings. Netanyahu, in private, was furious. "This is sabotage," he barked at his team. "He's undermining international law." "No," a senior aide finally said, hesitating. "He's forcing it to work." Meanwhile, in a quiet café 2 blocks from the UN building, Traoré sat with a small group of African youth leaders and student activists. The energy was electric. "You didn't just speak for Gaza," one young woman told him. "You spoke for anyone who's ever been told to wait for justice." Traoré smiled, but his tone remained grounded. "This isn't about heroism. It's about proof. And pressure. We have both now." Back inside the General Assembly, murmurs had turned into motion. A group of Latin American and Asian delegates called for a special session to review the evidence Traoré presented. Western powers hesitated, but global momentum was shifting. Suddenly, it wasn't just a Middle Eastern issue. It was a question of the system. Traoré returned to the chamber and took his seat with calm defiance. His allies were no longer just the ones who applauded. They were the ones who could no longer look away. And somewhere in his silence, the world had found a voice. 3 days after Traoré's intervention, an emergency resolution was introduced on the floor of the United Nations. It called for an immediate independent investigation into the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, with Traoré's evidence as the starting point. It was unprecedented. Never before had a leader from a non-belligerent nation initiated such a motion with this much global support. Some called it overreach. Others called it justice. Netanyahu's delegation moved quickly to block it. They rallied their traditional allies, leaning hard on old agreements and defense contracts. One by one, calls were made. Deals were whispered in side rooms. Leverage was quietly applied. But for each door Netanyahu tried to close, another opened unexpectedly. South Africa pledged support. Brazil called the motion long overdue. Even a Scandinavian nation, typically neutral, broke silence. "We cannot keep funding neutrality while civilians bleed." When the resolution went to vote, everyone expected a stall. Instead, they got a shock. The measure passed. Not unanimously, but powerfully. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded as if the outcome had already existed in the people's will, and the vote only made it real. Netanyahu, for the first time during the summit, looked smaller. He leaned toward a member of his team and whispered, "We underestimated him." Later that evening, a reporter caught up with Traoré as he exited the building. "Mr. President," she asked breathlessly, "what would you say to critics who claim you're escalating tensions by inserting yourself into this?" Traoré turned, met her gaze, and replied, "If telling the truth escalates things, then maybe it's the lies that kept us comfortable." He kept walking. And the cameras kept rolling. In the aftermath of the resolution's passage, whispers turned into waves. Major European donors announced reviews of their arms deals with Israel. Several UN committees, once hesitant to touch the topic, now fast-tracked investigations. It wasn't just about Gaza anymore. It was about accountability, and how long global institutions could ignore it. Inside a restricted strategy room, Netanyahu met with his closest advisors. "This isn't just bad press," one of them said. "It's structural damage. Your image as a peace broker is shattered." Netanyahu cut in. "Say it." The room fell silent. Elsewhere in New York, Traoré met with a diverse coalition of delegates, from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and even dissenting voices from within the West. They called it the Bridge Bloc. Their aim, to transform symbolic resolutions into concrete policy shifts, sanctions on illegal settlements, independent access to blockaded zones, and guarantees of aid distribution without political strings. "We're not here to embarrass anyone," Traoré said, "but if justice embarrasses you, perhaps it's time to examine your position." Meanwhile, American networks tried to reframe the narrative. Some hosts accused Traoré of grandstanding on foreign soil. Others, however, began inviting him for interviews, curious about the man who had changed the conversation without raising a weapon. One particular interview caught fire. The journalist asked, "President Traoré, did you come here with the intention to start a movement?" "No," he answered. "I came to end a silence." That line echoed through universities, youth forums, even the halls of the African Union. Netanyahu's administration felt the walls closing in. One leaked internal memo read: "If Traoré gains more regional traction, we risk losing control of the narrative, not just in Gaza, but globally." Traoré, however, wasn't chasing narratives. He was chasing peace. And he was doing it the only way he knew how. By telling the truth where others would trade it. The final day of the summit arrived with a strange stillness. The corridors of the United Nations, usually humming with rushed footsteps and low-stakes diplomacy, now echoed with anticipation. Everyone, delegates, aides, journalists, knew the eyes of the world were watching. Traoré took the podium one last time. He wore no flag pin. No prepared notes. Just a plain folder tucked under his arm and the gaze of someone who had already made peace with being misunderstood. "This assembly was called for peace," he began, "but peace cannot exist where truth is strangled and pain is denied." He paused. "My country, Burkina Faso, is not perfect. We've faced conflict, poverty, and our own internal failures. But we've never allowed our wounds to justify someone else's oppression. That is not strength. That is cowardice." The room held its breath. To those who ask why Africa cares about Gaza, let me answer plainly: because we remember. We remember what it means to be stripped of voice, agency, and dignity. And we won't watch another people be erased while the world debates definitions. He held up a photograph, grainy but powerful. It showed a Gazan child planting a tree in a field of rubble. This is not about sides. This is about survival. Then, he closed the folder and looked straight at Netanyahu, who sat frozen at his desk. "You can sign every treaty. Shake every hand. Smile for every camera. But if your peace demands silence from the oppressed, then you're not building peace. You're burying it." The chamber fell into profound silence. No applause. No cameras flashing. Just stillness. And then, slowly, one delegate stood. Then another. And another. Not clapping. Not shouting. Simply standing. A silent chorus of conscience. Later, as Traoré walked down the marble steps, a journalist called out, "What now?" He looked back only once and replied, "Now, we see who truly wants peace, because I've said my part." And just like that, the summit ended not with agreements, but with a reckoning. A reckoning that echoed far beyond the walls of the UN.